It seems to me that without question, you cannot have ultimately a long-term successful market-based economy if you don't have fundamentals such as rule of law, neutral forums for adjudication of contract disputes, an independent judiciary, freedom of the press. All of those are completely the lifeblood of a market economy. And by definition, if you have those, you then also have institutions that are in place to provide and guarantee freedom for citizens.
The U.S. government's focus, and I think our media focus, has also been on elections. And the election happens and we turn our attention away. The hard part is what comes after elections. How do you build the institutions that Betty was talking about, continuing to stay the course? And I think President Obama and Secretary Kerry get huge credit for having this big summit here so that America wakes up to what's happening in Africa, the potential for investment in business, and to debate these issues here in America and to hear from Africans about these issues.
I have a feeling that over the next week there's one very important part of this whole story that is going to be under-discussed, and that is the rapid financialization of Africa. And that's because a lot of the people who will be at the summit are corporate leaders, people who actually make things, but underpinning all of that is this enormous and unprecedented pace of financialization, which will require all of the things that we're discussing to the nth degree. So I can see why China and Africa, for many reasons, that partnership is happening both from a capital perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective. That, yes, democracy and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly is held to high regards, but so is building infrastructure. So is taking people higher up on the food chain of development. So I don't think it's as simple as the China model versus the quote-unquote Western model.
If we could have a strategy that said, let's have benevolent dictators, that would be an interesting strategy, but that's a hope and not a strategy. Yeah. Democracy arises from authoritarianism. We see that in South Korea, Argentina, Chile, Portugal. So I get that you have to transition through some authoritarian period, but you have to do it while building institutions. And so for me, to answer your specific question, I think business has a deep interest in rule of law, and it should focus completely on rule of law and not get caught up into, sort of the human rights argument, but rather say, if you want our investment dollars, we need a judiciary system that works, contract-based adjudication mechanisms, and let the rule of law be the vehicle that allows us to marry our interest in freedom with our interest in economic growth.
Most government officials in Africa understand there's the U.S. government, they understand the private sector is a very different entity, and they do distinguish. And I think the U.S. government advocating for these things actually, in some ways, takes the pressure off of the private sector companies that want rule of law, want these institutions, but are willing to have the government play the heat shield and make those arguments. That
the U.S. has to play two roles, which is on the one hand promote U.S. investment, on the other hand promote rule of law, and I think very specifically freedom of the press. So I view those as two separate but complementary agendas. We should not expect our private sector to go into a country and carry the flag of everything the U.S. government wants. That's conditionality that is silly and counterproductive. We should have them do what they do, and we should have them subject to, hopefully, a more robust press and rule of law in that country that we, as the government, are promoting. That, I think, is where you find sort of the right atmosphere.
The other fundamental challenge is obviously when we talk about the media and freedom of the media. And I think that's also where one of the challenges that Africans will raise about the media is that I'm sure most African presidents are united in thinking that the media is most irresponsible in their continents, only focuses on all the wrongs, especially the wrongs of government or fault finding, rather than becoming vibrant critics or just spaces for greater interaction. But fundamentally, beyond just the things we talk about, judiciary and media, I think the real challenge that is missing is cultures of participation, especially for business, because I think many businesses use opportunities and access to politicians for their own benefit. So when we talk about the rule of law, it's a rule of law as regards, with regard to my own benefit. We don't, and we sort of use a lot of these processes to just gain advance. So I think for me, the more fundamental thing is that a lot of African businesses haven't learned the real benefit of sound institutions and haven't invested sufficiently in them. And African civil society and others are over-focused, in my view, on elections rather than all these other fundamental institutions that will create a much more level economic playing field for all actors, whether foreign or local.
If you don't have something larger than 54 countries, which creates a sort of a political magnet for making hard choices, it'll be very, very difficult to create the kind of harmonization that you want.
To really have a democratic culture, you need all these institutions to work. The judiciary needs to be a good arbiter, right? For many of our countries, the judiciary is very, very weak. And even as we try to secure it, there's just some physical challenges. One of the challenges, of course, of Africa is that it's all these 54 countries with different company laws and different trade rules. The regional integration project represents a lot of promise for us in expanding markets, and something like East Africa with its common external tariff and 120 million people makes a difference. The reality for most businesses is that despite years of talk of regional integration, borders are as much alive as they were 50 years ago. So there's a lot of non-tariff barriers in terms of access to different markets that haven't yet been addressed. And a lot of African leaders talk, with lots of passion about creating a single African market and do very little on the ground to actually create it.
I think it goes without saying that that the Chinese model within China was, we should first give credit where credit's due. It's extraordinary. Anyone who's traveled in China and has spent their lives thinking about development and poverty knows that it's just an extraordinary growth path, but it's also something that has brought up 400 plus million people out of dire poverty. And if you translate that model from clear plans, clear strategies of development into Africa, you can see where that appeal comes from. I'll also just add that what we're seeing in sort of global capital markets is that the real challenge that Africa will face, in my opinion, to your point, is the short-termism of foreign capital that's coming into Africa, as opposed to patient capital, which the Chinese are providing into Africa. And it's a fundamental difference, right? When we work with private equity firms, we have private equity funds too. And the idea that you can go into Africa and build a business in 5 to 7 years, sell it and leave, is absurd. It's absurd for anyone who's actually spent time there and talked to CEOs, talked to entrepreneurs, etc. So the philosophy of long-term patient capital is something that the Chinese savings pools have developed and brought into Africa. And I think we as Americans, but also we as another large capital pool, should take that into consideration as we think about investing in Africa.
When I talk to people in the U.S. government about this, and people would say, well, why should we focus on Africa? We need to focus on Africa. It doesn't mean the government's going to solve these problems, and Africans, like President Banda, are going to need to take the leadership in driving this, but we need to be there as a partner to help those who are fighting corruption, because I still think it is a challenge, and are building out the infrastructure that will free the vitality of all these young people, if we skill them correctly, to take part in the economy and to create that next economic boom for the world.